I don't know, but turn off the video. Interesting. So it's not be on the screen anywhere. It's probably, and then just stop the recording.
A quick Q&A, and for everyone at home on Zoom, if you just type into the chat box if you have any questions, and we'll endeavour to get those across as well. After the event, Jonica will be inside signing copies of the book, so make sure you stick around for a signing and to say hi. And if you post on social media tonight, be sure to tag us. Guys, there's plenty of room out the front, and Jonica as well. Plenty of room out the front if you'd like to come on in. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonica Newby. Jonica is a science reporter, author, TV presenter, and director, best known for her 2 decades on ABC TV's popular weekly science program, Catalyst. She has twice won the Eureka Award, Australia's most prestigious science journalism prize, and is a recipient of a World TV Award. In conversation with Jonica tonight is Dr. Amanda Niehaus. Amanda is a biologist and award-winning writer who lives locally in Brisbane. Most recently, she authored the acclaimed novel, The Breeding Season. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I think you're in for something special. I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to be here speaking with Jonica and with all of you tonight. Jonica's book, Beyond Climate Grief, is a story of many things, including snow and beer cans and crazy bike rides and hope, right? Which hope is something that we all really, really need in the world right now. So Jonica, I would love to start off a bit. You come from a science background, as I do, but this is very much, though this book has lots of science in it, I wouldn't call it a science book. So how did you come into this kind of writing? What drew you to tell the stories in the way that you did here?
Well, it's a very emotional book. It is actually a book about emotions. Each chapter is told through the prism of an emotion or mental state. But the fact is, there are a lot of climate books out there that are full of facts and figures, and most of them by this point, they just send me into despair, I'll be honest. Then they don't speak to me emotionally, and I got to the point where that's what I needed, and I thought maybe others need that too, and if that doesn't exist, maybe I should write it. But actually the reasons for writing it are far more personal and self-orientated. I've been struggling. I'd never heard of this term climate grief until I realized that is what I had fallen deep into, and it's a really recent thing for me because all those years as a science reporter, I thought I understood climate change, but it turns out I only understood it intellectually. It hadn't hit me emotionally. So I think for me now, that's my definition of climate grief. It's what happens to you when all of a sudden you get this personal tipping point where you suddenly realize it's going to affect something or someone that matters to me. This isn't just some abstract thing. Now, for me, it was because of my love for snow. So I want to introduce the concept I talk about in the book called heart places. Well, I just call them heart places. So you know how we fall in love with a place just as we fall in love with people, and we're primed to do so. You know, often we have much of the same chemicals. I mean, think of a beach or a farm or a forest or somewhere that really speaks to you. And we fall in love with different places and to each other, you know, just like as we fall in love with different people. And I call them our heart places. And one of mine is the snow. And I fell in love with snow before I ever met snow because I grew up a long way from snow. So I'm going to read you a little bit from the opening chapter of the book, which is called Grief. This is actually a memoir, this book, so it is a personal journey. So Grief, my love for snow, a tale of magic, adventure, love, despair, and the fight to save winter. I've always wondered why I fell for snow, because I grew up on a beach on the edge of a desert, about as far from snow as you could get. Perth, Western Australia, 3,000 kilometres from the nearest mountains. Frankly, 3,000 kilometres from anywhere. So you think I'd be a beach babe, and I was. But as a little girl, gazing at the white sand and clear blue water of Cottesloe Beach, somehow it was another white landscape that captured my imagination. A land of dramatic peaks and frosted statues, of sleigh bells and dragons and high-stakes adventures and the ever-present possibility of magic. My mind was being captured by snow. And this is the thing about snow. It's not just a substance in our natural world. It's part of our fantasy world. You know, it makes us think of magic and Tinkerbell. And, you know, it sparkles like it's glittering with some sort of otherworldly force. And think of all our fairy tales. They're full of snow. Lord of the Rings blew my tiny preteen mind. Can you imagine Lord of the Rings set in Fiji? It just doesn't have quite the same magic, does it? So that's how I fell in love with snow before I even met it. And then when I moved east to be a science reporter, I got to fall in love with a real snow place. This is Kunamanamaji, the word I've learnt to call Australia's snowy mountains. And they are every bit as fantastical and magical as what I read about as a child. You know, you have wombats who make little snow caves. You have pygmy possums that lie under little comforting blankets of snow to keep them from the cold. You have these snow gums that are like an enchanted tree. They have these twisting, twirling rubies and golds and silver colored trunks that glow. And then these limbs spread out to the leaves that are coated in ice and they glitter in the sun like chandeliers. This snowscape of ours is as precious and magical as our Great Barrier Reef. But they were separate in my mind, my fantasy world and my real world of science reporting, until they began to clash. And it was 2017, not long ago at all. I was on a holiday in Japan, as it happens. My first ever, in fact, one of my friends who I met there is here tonight. My first ever time to Japan. I was really excited. I was skiing powder for the first time. I was hanging out with Swiss ski instructors on holidays. Hang on, what's a Swiss ski instructor doing here on holidays? It's January, his busiest time of year. So I asked him and he said, I came to find good snow. So it turned out that Switzerland had a green Christmas that year. There was no snow. And later that week, half the Great Barrier Reef died. And as I looked around at my fantasy place, I just started to think, it could come here too. And when I got back to Australia, I couldn't settle and look at, you know, freelance work and the things I was supposed to do, you know, worrying about keto diets like all science reporters do. I just couldn't. I was worried about snow. And so I actually spent the next year researching what was going to happen to snow and talking to a whole lot of scientists from around the world. And I was going to try and develop a documentary about it. But sometime during that year, as I was discovering, you know, the importance of snow as an ecosystem as well as its importance culturally, I started to crack. And, you know, I was interviewing a scientist in America, and he started crying when I asked him, are we the generation that kills snow? And he was picturing, he said, his grandchildren not being able to build a snowman. And when I got, so mid-2018, I kind of had a bit of a breakdown. I just was crying a lot. And I actually went to my doctor seeking antidepressants, first time in my life. And that's actually only the first chapter in the book, you'll be pleased to know, not the last. It's just the beginning of the adventure, because I ended up not taking those antidepressants. I did something very different instead, and that's the beginning of the adventure that became this book.
So I love that concept of a heart place. Do you think, and in talking in all of the conversations that you've had in the writing of this book and beyond, do you think people know their heart place, or do you think that's part of the journey that we have to all go on in order to sort of react more strongly to climate change?
I think when you describe what you mean by a heart place and then ask people, everyone can picture one. Everyone. And I made up the word. So maybe it's a word that will help people connect with that, because when you think of your heart place and then you picture what might happen to it in 10 years' time, and I don't think any of us would have imagined what just happened on the south coast of New South Wales where I live, let alone in the places that have just flooded or been hit by cyclones. When you think of that, or not just the disaster, but the gradual, sea level rise or whatever's going to affect your heart place, then you can connect with it. And that brings us to the second chapter, actually, which is how I came to think of this as so similar to the way we deal with a partner or a loved one who might be sick, and another way of connecting instead of just looking away from climate change too hard, So the second chapter is called Love. And I tell the story of what happened with my partner, Robin Williams, a few years ago. And it's a story that I'd never told to anyone. I think I'd told about 3 people. But I put it in the book for a reason, and you'll understand why when I explain it. So the second chapter is called Love. So Robin Williams, he does the science show on Radio National. So, yeah, he's my partner. And so he got diagnosed with cancer, largely due to his own powers of stupid denial. He was bleeding from the bowel for 2 years and he didn't get it checked, did he? I wasn't happy when I found that out. Anyway, so
wait.
Yeah.
So you weren't checking his?
No. Too much information. I know, what kind of partner am I? So anyway, where was I? So yeah, so he had the chemo, and it was preventive chemo, but he had an ileostomy at the time. And anyway, we were all told everything would be fine. And he wasn't that sick. So there's this day in 2015, it was January 2nd, I think. So, Christmas. And I was down on the south coast and happened to be home relatively early that day because I had gone surfing earlier than usual. And I'm lying reading on the deck, and it's our little holiday cottage that we live in now. And I hear the thump inside, and I keep reading, and I think, oh, maybe I should check on that thump. And I go inside, and there on the floor is my partner of 25 years, and he's white, like a piece of paper. And he's not breathing, and his eyes are open, and he's going, which I kind of knew from my veterinary days that I dimly remembered was agonal breathing. Like, this is not good. And so I'm racing to his side. I remember seeing, this beautiful sunny day, thinking, oh my God, this is the moment he dies. This is it, And I'm reaching for a pulse, trying to find a pulse, can't find a pulse. And I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do CPR. I last did it at swim class when I was 10 years old. And then I get to about, I think, 3 minutes. It's not like I'm looking at my watch. And I know that at 4 minutes, you're talking about brain damage. And I've got one of the smartest guys in the country down on the floor. And I go, and I remember Norman Swan just said, just push. So I went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And on 6, this line of pink went up his body and up his face. And he woke up and he said, why are you crying? And I said, just give me a minute. And I turned him into the coma position to shut him up. And so later, when I thought back on this grief I was feeling about the snow and my heart place, and I started over time putting it together with this event of having a diagnosis, a potentially lethal one with your partner. And all sorts of parallels started to come through. The obvious one was Robin's sheer bloody denial, that denial of your own death. Even after that, he refused to go to the hospital. Zach knows him. He refused to go to the hospital, and I had to try and force him. And because he just couldn't conceive that it was real, analogies with climate change, or disasters, anyone? But the bigger reason for putting it in the book and in the chapter called Love is that it asks the question, what would you do to save the one you love? And the answer is whatever you can, whether it works or not. You don't just turn away and go, oh, too hard, I'll worry about that later. You know, you do what you can. You still love every minute with that person while they're there, but you don't lose sight of the long term that they've got cancer, and you're going to do everything you can in the meantime to try and prevent that worst outcome. And so it seemed, what a powerful way of thinking, a lifelong way of thinking about how you try to save your heart place, or, you know, the planet, the coral. Professor Ove is here, who's the coral expert. You do whatever you can. You don't lose sight of it. And, you know, we so often communicate about climate through fear. And fear is really important. But, you know, that neurochemistry is designed to spike and drop, spike and drop, spike and drop. Next fear, next fear. You know, can't even remember what the last disaster was. We're on to the next one. It's not good for long-term action. It wasn't designed for it. But love is actually neurochemically designed to make us protect what we love. That's why we fall in love with places as well as people. It's there to make us protect our homes, our communities. And so to me, I think that's a better way to keep yourself sustained than just concentrating on the fear.
Absolutely. I really related to that chapter. And it is the thing though, isn't it? Over time, you start to take things for granted again. So you almost need kind of these little love dates with your environment just as much as with your partner, with your.
Totally.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, so you'd started working on a documentary about snow. So how did that transition into the book that you eventually wrote?
Yeah, I had no intention of writing a book. This experience of this profound climate grief, let alone the experience with Robin, they were really personal, private things. I talked with very few people about them. But in 2019, which is not very long ago, do you remember that other planet? 2019. About halfway through, I found that I was having conversations like this with other people. I hate to drop you in at Ove, but Professor Ove, I can never say last name, Ove Goldberg, a coral expert in IPCC, you know, senior writer and so on, has had to be dealing with this for so long. And I had this really, you know, heartfelt conversation with him in 2019, where we weren't talking about the facts, we were just talking about how we feel. I had a similar conversation with someone else, and I just thought, God, I'm not the only one really struggling with this, and no one's really talking about it. No one has a place to put this, or even a way to get through it. And I thought, well, I'll write a book, I'll go on a journey. I need the help, for God's sake, you know. Maybe I can share what I find. And I had a model in mind for the book, which was like Lee Sales' Any Ordinary Day, so that I'd start just with my story, and then I'd you know, ask all these interesting people about their experience. And it wouldn't be full of scientists at all. It would be people from everywhere. So Missy Higgins, Charlie Pickering, and business leaders, kids, a good variety of people. So, but here's the thing, I started writing the book in October 2019. And within 2 weeks, the world was changing, and like this distant threat, this kind of, I was focused on snow. Meanwhile, climate change was coming to get me, you know. These fires were building, starting up in your part of the woods, and then just heading down like this monster tidal wave of all-consuming fire. So this background in the book, it comes to the foreground, and it became a memoir, a diary, a true diary of trying to write a book like this during that time. And just when I think things can't get more escalated and epic, they do. And you know, I'd had this notion at the beginning with the snow grief that, oh my God, I'm living Lord of the Rings, you know. It is literally black coal versus white snow. And, you know, all of us are Frodo. What would Frodo,
right there.
What would Frodo do? Yeah. The line I most regret taking out of the book when the editors asked me to take it out. Yeah. But anyway, but did anyone else feel like over the last year that they've fallen into the plot of a post-apocalyptic novel? I think we all ended up having that. And so that feeling, that novelistic quality to it comes through in the book. And then, of course, my mother lives in Malakuta. So the last quarter or third of the book actually takes us through from there into the beginning of COVID and talks about things like disaster brain and acceptance and meaning and all these things I could never have imagined I'd be writing about. But I guess it makes it a very timely book.
Definitely. And actually, now that you bring that up, that moment, if I remember correctly, you wake up and check and you realize
check the app.
Yeah, check the fires app and you realize that your mom only has 10 minutes to get out. And that's a really powerful, like, you know, it just stops you in your tracks when you read something like that.
Yes. Anyway, we'll come to that in a
Yes,
bit.
we'll come to that. We'll come to that. So one of the great messages of the book is about hope. But I think it's one of the other things that I think that you discuss through all the different emotions that you move through is that it's maybe not enough to hope. You need something beyond just hope. So
Yes.
do you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. So has anyone experienced in the last few years their hopes being dashed on climate action? Yeah, well, I was really starting to have some problems with hope. Because, you know, just when you think things might go in the right direction, bang, along comes the sociopath and it goes in the other direction.
Did you want to elaborate?
No. I nearly did on radio the other day and I suddenly found I had to backpedal very fast because talking about sociopaths and political leadership might not have been the smartest thing on the ABC. I managed to not name names and I did get myself just out of that hole. But anyway, but quite seriously, I think, you know, I started to think, what's the point of hoping? I've got to stop hoping because I keep getting so devastated when my hopes are dashed. And yet that felt like a personal failing because it's like, are you saying you've lost hope? Well, then you're a bad person or what's the point of life? You know, so it's really quite a complex thing I was struggling with. And then I heard this podcast by a woman called Anna Rose. Some of you might have heard of her. She's been an incredible activist and she helped found Farmers for Climate Action. And she talked about courage. And it was like this light bulb moment. Of course, courage. And she explained how the word, look at the derivation of it, the French, coeur, heart, love, rage, anger, fight. And so it's that anger and fight to save and protect what you love. And it's a beautiful word, courage, courage. And of course, I thought this is what you fall back on in those moments when hope doesn't feel like the right thing. You fall back on, you can go whisper to yourself or to others, courage. And courage is contagious too. We've seen that with the climate strike kids. You know, they get up there and do their striking and all of a sudden there's 7 million people joining them. So courage became a really powerful idea.
Yeah, and actually with the climate strike kids, I know a lot of them, it seems in the book, a lot of them never intended to become the voice or never intended to sort of lead in the way that they ended up. And so it's almost like they had this courage within themselves that did infect others.
Inspire others.
And
Yeah,
inspire others.
Absolutely. And I won't do the reading tonight because I want to get on to other things, but I've been reading from the chapter about the Castlevan Kids because it's just so joyful. There's a lot of really joyful stories in this book. Don't worry, it only starts in grief. And so I went to see them in November of 2019. And, you know, I thought I'd interview them because I knew that they'd started the Australian strikes. And so I thought that'd be interesting. And I only found them, like phone numbers for them, a day or so before I went down there. I paid to get down to Melbourne just for 2 days, and I'd only just got the numbers, and anyway, so I'd had all these frantic phone calls with their parents, and ended up basically being that I would drive an hour and a half out of Melbourne to Castlevan and stay the night with them, and they just interview whatever chaos was going on as they all had dinner. So that's what happened. And so I've not met them, you know, I'm a bit wrung out because I'd had an interview with Missy Higgins and with Charlie Pickering that day, and they've been really emotional. And so I start chatting to Harriet, who's 15 at the time, or 14, and you know, and I ask her, you know, so was it just you, or you know, and it suddenly struck me as I was talking to her. I said, were there anybody else striking at the time, or just Greta? And she said, no, just Greta. They weren't aware of any other strikes at all. They just saw this kid in Sweden and thought, we could do that. There's 3 of us. We'll go on strike at our school. And then they met someone going, you know, you can make it a bit bigger. All right. Oh, well, we'll delay it a bit and we'll do it in Melbourne. And then they dropped this next bombshell. It was just, oh, we needed some help because none of us have phones. And so someone else came along and did the social media for them. And then they're going, oh yeah, look, we might get 100 kids to Melbourne on the 30th of November. 15,000 kids turned up all around Australia, and another 5,000 worldwide. And what those Australian kids did is that those images went out around the world and set the stage for the global strikes. So you see, Greta had definitely lit the match, and there were a number of you know, protests every Friday of a few hundred, and that was kind of, but it was just simmering along. And then along came these 3 Australian kids who don't even have phones, and they just thought, oh, we could get 10 of us there. And all of a sudden, whoop, you've got the bonfire. And they're the ones, and their courage that's given so much hope to all the rest of us.
100%, that's courage right there. That's the definition. Yeah. So you just mentioned Missy Higgins and Charlie Pickering.
Yes.
Did I just say that right? Okay. Yes.
Yes.
I did. Oh my God, I just panicked. I just. So how did you connect with them? Like, why?
Why them?
Yeah. Why them? Why them?
I love them. Bit of a fangirl moment. No, look, it was bigger than that, obviously. I always had these ideas that I wanted it to be not the usual suspects in this book, and I wanted it to kind of almost represent all different sectors of society. And I actually had this vision while I was doing it of this almost Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones more, you know, the gathering of the tribes, all the different people bringing their groups with them, which is why I had the business leaders too, because there's some amazing business leaders who are really pulling Australia kicking and screaming into the next economy. And I absolutely celebrate them in this book too. But yeah, Missy Higgins, of course, I've always loved her work, but I found out while I was doing this book that she had experienced a climate grief collapse, if you call it that, as profound as mine. And she had written an album about it called Solastalgia, based on the Glenn Albrecht term. And obviously many of you know. And I listened to it, and I was bloody Missy Higgins, you know, out come the waterworks. But they're unlike any songs I've ever heard. I don't know if any of you heard them. They are about, facing a climate apocalypse in some of these. There's one about not wanting to have kids or being afraid of having kids. And very different fodder and so beautiful. So obviously I wanted to interview her. And so we had this gorgeous interview, and she and we talked a lot about music and how it actually unites, but also pulls at emotions and says things that words can't say. And that actually ended up being quite a theme, because I literally played one of her songs at some of the key moments in that next 6 months in real life, not because of the book, but I then reflected on it and put it in the book. And there's one where it talks about hold me, and I realized that this is actually, if we're facing our partner's death or we're on the cliff face of something terrible, all we actually want is someone to hold us. And that song is so beautiful. But she also had really great practical information, which I have used. So things like being really careful about your information diet, because the whole nature of news is designed to get the cortisol up through the roof. chronic stress, chronic anxiety, even the climate news, it's really, really terrible all the time. And so physiologically, we're just drowning in that soup of anxiety. And so to be mindful of not reading it too much, not doom scrolling, getting the information you need so that you're not in denial, but balancing it out with, and I now subscribe to some of the sites that she suggested that literally only do good news. That's all they do. And they do it for this reason. Charlie Pickering, yeah, well, again, I really like him, but also I always wanted to have a chapter in there called humour, because we don't have enough laughs about climate change. You know, it does tend to be very serious. And I was struck by how when Robin was really sick, how many more jokes, in fact, our joking kind of went up through the roof. And there's a reason for that. And it comes to why laughter evolved. So laughter physiologically does these fantastic things. It decreases all our cortisol. So if we've just lost our home in a fire, what do? Amongst other things, laugh and cry, literally. And I asked all these people, you know, so you've just lost your home. What jokes have you been telling? And, you know, it's like, well, they weren't expecting that question. But you could see their faces light up and, you know, just that sense of relaxed. And the reason they tell the jokes is because it's like being ambulance people, you need to debrief, right? And the other thing it does, laughter, is it releases oxytocin. It's a very social thing. You can laugh on your own, but you're much more likely to laugh in a group. And so the laughter releases oxytocin, which is bonding. And so in that laughter, even in the worst possible circumstances, you're reminded that you're safe right now and you are with others. You are not alone. And it was a chance to really talk about how powerful that is as a human gift, I guess. And I saw it writ large later on as things really escalated into their epic 2020-ness.
Yeah, absolutely. I really loved those parts of the book. I really related with the Missy Higgins chapter, particularly for reasons that we were talking about just before, where sometimes when you're inundated with all of these facts and all of this information and you feel so powerless, and you get fatigued by your sense that you can't do anything, or there's not enough that one individual can do. And she really speaks to that in a very kind of wise, like, you got to look after yourself, you know, to sort of be able to keep up the momentum.
Yeah, she really does. And in a later chapter, which is called Worry, which is the chapter where I specifically had a question, which I had before I even started the book, which is how should parents deal with their kids' emotions around climate change, particularly when they're no doubt struggling to process their own emotions around climate change. So I actually went and got hold of some key psychologists to ask that question. And controlling the information diet. I've lost the train of what I was going to say with that. So you're saying about looking after yourself. Yeah. So they came up with this. I boiled part of it down to a slightly glib algorithm, but first name and validate the emotion, because, you know, and even using the term climate grief is part of that. Because when you say grief, climate anxiety sounds like a pathology. So does eco-anxiety, like there's something wrong with you. Climate grief, it covers every emotion, and it's normal. You know, so name and validate, but, you know, in the kids' case, it might be fear or whatever. You say, you know, that's okay, people can feel that, and then change what you can. That's the next thing. And then the last part is accept what you can't. And this comes back to what Missy Higgins talks about in that chapter. It's like, once you've done the action part, and I don't mean it's a one-off, I mean once you settle on what your actions are going to be, the rest is out of your hands. And us learning how to process and accept what we can't do is part of learning to live a good life. Under the question I actually asked myself right at the beginning is, how do I live a good and happy life under the weight of this fearsome knowledge? And so as time has gone on, and there's a whole chapter on acceptance, which comes after the fires, which is also about, you know, grief rituals and accepting what just happened. But I've realized that kind of accepting what you can't is the real heart of the self-care part of that equation.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about denial, because that was a really strong chapter as well. It had just in sort of framing the way that we think about the people who don't value or believe in climate change, or who are deceiving themselves in some way. Would you like to speak to the denial?
Yeah, so that chapter, I was never wanting to look at denialists, because I think a lot of them, let's face it, are on the sociopathy spectrum, and there's not going to be, I know I keep coming back to sociopaths, but I've been thinking about them a lot lately. I didn't write about them, but I've been thinking about them. But there's a denial that we all use, that we evolved to use. And I think understanding that was what I wanted to explore in that chapter. And it comes under a heading that I loosely call Why We Never Think Disaster's Ever Going to Happen to Us. And in fact, I remember working with a disaster psychologist and a disaster psychiatrist, if there is such a thing. But these guys are experts in what happens during and after fires and other disasters. So how our brains change, how we don't accept the threat, and then we have to change and accept the threat, and then on to PTSD and so on. So I was already in touch with them, and then I would never imagine that it would become so personally relevant. But why do we never think disaster is going to happen to us? Well, that's one of the chapters I also called Professor Bill von Hippel about, who is an evolutionary biologist. So excuse me if I get some of it wrong. I'm sure I got it right in the book because I checked it with him. But essentially, part of it, I think, is really powerfully is we never think we can die. You know, we've evolved this mechanism so that we can get out of the cave, because if we actually imagined all the time our own deaths, we'd still be huddling in the cave. And so my partner, Robin, becomes this powerful metaphor for denial, which is, of course, totally ironic because he hates denialists. But he is in the book as my metaphor for denial. Because even, you know, after me bringing him back to life, I just fainted. You know, it's like fucking Monty Python. But anyway.
I think you should organize these events as sort of interventions.
I've had him along to a couple of them, and he sort of goes, "Moi?" But there's a reason, and you know, as I said, prospection is the word. But I mean, can we actually have full consciousness and awareness if that awareness brings with it constant awareness of the future reality of our own deaths? So we just assume it won't happen. But at some point, our brains have to flip out of their optimism bias into accepting that a threat is real. And I think the analogy with climate change is total, that you have to actually flip out of this optimism bias that everything is going to be the same as it always was. In other words, living your life as you always had, and that the threat is real. The other, you know, the coming on of the fires, the coming on of the floods, it's exactly the same thing. At some point, even the best of us as denialists, you know, if we're swimming in the flood, we might have to acknowledge that it's flooding. And we all have different personality types, and some of us are more of the optimistic style, and we are not that threat aware. I'm of the more threat aware style, and there's a lot to be said for that. You're good at convincing other people. You're good at politics and leadership of all kinds of things. Is a very important skill to be good at denial. But there comes a point where your life or the life of your community is at risk because of your stupid optimism, and you do have to flip. And I end up calling it some Chernobyl Guy Syndrome, which I will, which I explain in the book. I won't go into here, but you know, we're all guilty of Chernobyl Guy Syndrome at some point or another, but some of us are more guilty of it than others.
I loved those links to Chernobyl because that was one of my favorite series of the last few years. So that, and it was timely.
But I think if we acknowledge the denial in ourselves. I won't say it makes us more forgiving of others, but it's more understanding perhaps. And I hope that those that are of the more optimist mentality, such as my father, who is a top business leader and took a long time to convince that climate change existed, can understand why threat-aware people are important too. They're there to tell you the dinosaurs got loose in the friggin' Jurassic Park, you know?
I'm never going to watch that movie the same again. I'm like, that is the threat-aware person.
Yeah.
So the book definitely picks up pace as you go. And there are some chapters and scenes as we get toward the end. And we're sort of closing on the end now here too with before we take questions. So I wonder if you'd like to share some of those very kind of visceral, powerful, fire-centric moments with us.
Yeah, well, I've alluded to them already, actually, and there's a pivot point in the book, in the chapter that's actually called Joy, and it's the shortest chapter in the book, and it's actually just about Christmas in Giroa, and it's just a beautiful sort of homage, I suppose, to the power of the joy of living in the moment. And how important that is for everything. But it's just a description of Christmas. And but we're under ashfall, but you know, we form this little bubble. But that's, as I said, it's the pivot point, the fulcrum of the book between what happens before and what happens after. So Malakuta, yeah. I when I was writing the chapter about why we never think disaster is going to happen to us, I was guilty of thinking disaster couldn't happen to me. So I've had to confront my own denial in this process. I actually went up to Neboida because their town burnt down. I thought that'll be the closest I get to a fire, you know, I mean, not quite so glibly, but I wanted to have that perspective in the book, never imagining for a second that my whole south coast would be on fire. So I went into Malakuta a few weeks after the event because, you know, how prophetic, literally on the New Year's Eve of 2020. I mean, where's Nostradamus, for goodness sake? It's, it does have that sense of epic fiction narrative. You couldn't really make this up. So, yeah, I went back into Malakuta as soon as the roads were open a few weeks later, and Mum actually had got out just in time. And so she was a climate refugee for a while there. And when I was in a week in Malakuta, I just spoke to her friends. So this chapter got put together simply by talking to her friends and recording. I just asked them what it was like. None of them were professional firefighters because the firefighters were still off fighting fires at that point. And it just came together as this amazing filmic kind of epic story that puts you in this extraordinary place at this time and is actually, I think, really quite inspiring for the human spirit. But out of all that, there's 6 different sort of interweaving things. It's really very dramatic. As you can imagine, but this one I call Nicholas and the Disaster Movie Dash for reasons that will become apparent. And Nicholas, just to explain, he was the son of a friend of my mother's, so he's in his 30s, which is relevant. And he is one of the very few people who's decided to stay and defend his house because he bought a new house. He had young kids and the thought of it being destroyed. Now, let me qualify. These are people in a town. They're not sort of out in a farm surrounded by forests. They're in a town. His father-in-law has fought a fire before. Nicholas hasn't. And he's at the other end of the same drive with his house. And they have walkie-talkies because they're going to stay in contact that way. And the firefighters have already told them, you know, we're not going to come near you, you're on your own. That's why so few people stayed. And the fire trucks all surrounded the thousands of people down on the beach. So we pick up Nicholas, and as the fire came, and don't forget, it's virtually pitch black. The smoke is overwhelming, and the sound of it is like a 747. So the walkie-talkies are useless. Unexpectedly on his own, fortified with the desire to protect the life he's built, Nicholas enters survival mode running up and down the street, fighting spot fires with buckets of water, occasionally a hose. At one point, a power line came down on the road out the front of my house and it all started sparking. Oh God, my hand is at my mouth. And then everything was blazing behind me, and then everything was on fire as well in front of me. And I just thought, well, I can't go inside the house because all the houses are burning. And then I thought, well, if things get too bad, I'll just zip down to the beach on my bike and I'll kind of hide under the cliff face. That was my genius plan. Good one, I nod. It worked? Well, not really, he laughs. So I jumped on my bike and then I head to the beach. Like a scene from a movie, he pedals like the wind down a corridor of fire. All the houses ablaze, all the tea trees ablaze, flames flying 4 times their height, fireballs arcing overhead. It was just raging through the air, and I get there and there's a staircase that goes down onto the beach, and that was on fire. And I ditched my bike and then I ran down the burning stairs, but the fire actually came down the cliff face and the beach was on fire. All the tussocks, and I saw them start burning down the beach and heading into town, and I was like, holy shit. And I couldn't go that way and it was burning down the cliff face, so I ran to where the boat ramp is. I got up to the top and my bike, it was burnt to a crisp, and then another front came through, but on the other side, and it went all the way down to the boat ramp, and I was kind of stuck in the middle then, so I had to run through the golf course. My jaw is on the floor as Nicholas describes running from the flames, ending up doing a 2-kilometre high-speed loop around the back of the firefront to the other end of Terra Nova Drive, checking in on his father-in-law, then sprinting back to his end to pick up a bucket again, where, if anything, conditions are worse. There was fire everywhere. Pretty much every fence was on fire, and then the bushes, trees, houses, and then it kind of escalated. Houses would catch on fire, and then the next house would catch on fire. Everything at that time was just chaos, really. I was just running, just putting out fires. Amid this sensory and emotional overload, with 10 houses burning around him, Nicholas's brain encodes a new knowledge, the dreadful keening sound a home makes just before it dies. It starts chuffing like it's burning on the inside. It starts chuffing and you can see it. The windows start to bend and then bam, the window pops and then it just explodes like a freaking bomb. And then just the thought in your head, like the animals, all the trees. Nicholas looks up, grieving. It's like all the things, the beauty this place has to offer is burning in front of you, and it's out of your control, you know? There's nothing really. You're just a person with 2 buckets.
That's like, you almost just want to clap right then. Hey? Like that image of 2 buckets, right?
Yeah.
It's so powerful.
Well, and this is the thing, you know, when writing the book was obviously an incredibly personal and private experience, literally, because the last couple of chapters, I was writing it within 2 weeks of the events actually happening. I mean, this is a true diaristic, novelistic kind of event, and which meant that the last 2 chapters were written during lockdown of COVID. So there was no time to kind of reflect on it or even to talk to anyone about it. So when I had to choose readings, when the book came out only recently, I thought I'd be reading a different I thought I'd be reading about Postmistress Pam and Squiggy the pig, which is a beautiful story. But when I looked at it, it wasn't self-contained. It was scattered over a few different vignettes. And I hadn't noticed till I started reading Nicholas's story what an amazing metaphor it is. You know, we're all just a person with climate change. We're all just a person with 2 buckets. And, you know, some of us can bring really big buckets along, like Mike Cannon-Brookes is he has some bloody big buckets and that literally that buckets of money he is putting toward making an inspiring future for Australia's economy, let alone for the world. And I do have a whole chapter on that. Me, I'm just a person with very much smaller buckets, but we all have to bring what we can. And it comes back to that thing of what would you do to save the one you love? You just do whatever you can, but you don't look away. You don't not fight the fire. You don't pretend it's not happening. And there's a quote right at the end of the book, which a friend of mine pointed out, links with this really beautifully, which is in the chapter called Meaning, where I had to try and make sense of everything that had happened over the previous 6 months, which, we're all still obviously trying to process all that. But it's a quote attributed to Gandhi: whatever you do will be insignificant, and yet it is essential that you do it. And you can't know whether your action will work or not. But you just have to know that you tried, right? And it may work. And the book is full of examples where accidentally it did. I didn't know. Well, Nicholas, for example, with his 2 buckets, he did save his house and 5 others with 2 buckets. And the Climate Strike kids with their no phones. Look at what they did. I mean, there's all these sort of accidental everyday heroes, and it made me think about the concept of heroism. To me, what I realized is that heroism just looks like ordinary people doing right by those they love, often in extremis. You just do what you can. And from the outside, I think that can be honored as heroism. And that's where I refer to the fact that we all have a bit of the epic hero within. It's simply that if we're decent folks who are not sociopaths, we are driven by these emotions of empathy, and we're overwhelmed by emotions like the penultimate chapter in the book is about pride, which is the emotion we feel when we do right by our community, the emotion others feel about us. Yeah. When we do right by our community. How often do you feel proud? It's usually of your loved ones, or there are RFS people. God, I couldn't look at an RFS person in uniform without bursting into tears for weeks after the fires had stopped. The nurses, the same in the early days of COVID. And so all these great emotions actually come to the fore in most people. And we just try to do right by those around us that we love. And that very part of it is part of what gave me a lot more hope for the future. I mean, we are in a state of enormous flux right now. Of course we are. But I like to think that we will look back on 2020 as a social pivot point. It won't be so apparent just yet how it's all going to turn out. But I think more and more of us are hitting that emotional tipping point where we see that this is not something we can ignore anymore, that we have to find our ways to do what we can and accept what we can't, and look to things like the other big notion in the book that I haven't really had a chance to talk about yet is the notion of active hope, which is this gift you give of your action to create the future that you want, which is a very powerful philosophy. There's other words for it. Transformational resilience comes into that. At the back part of the book does go quite a lot into post-trauma growth, and in a way that point where you actually feel in your bones what climate change means for you emotionally, not just as an abstract. It is a kind of trauma when you hit that. That's why grief is the right word. You have to travel through that. You don't get to kind of go, oh, I'll just ignore it. You can, but then you're stuck. You're stuck in the stage of grief called denial or toxic anger or any of those. And I think if anything, the book is about the journey of not being afraid to feel those emotions, go through them and use them as the bouncing point to then how you're going to live the rest of your life. And the active hope, one of the reasons I really like it is it uses this language of, of epic narrative. In fact, the inventor of it really liked science fiction and fantasy. And she talks about, catching an inspiring vision and grabbing onto it. And I'm sure a lot of you here have already caught an inspiring vision, and that's where you give your gift of active hope. I suppose in many ways this book was my attempt, my gift at the moment of active hope to help others who might be going through this process. There hasn't been another book like this that is actually a memoir structure, so that it makes it very easy to read, I suppose. But I hope that by sharing it, yeah, it opens a conversation and helps others. It was particularly being a science reporter, I obviously found out some really interesting stuff too.
No, and just before we sort of say thank you and good night, I just want to sort of reaffirm that I do feel that your book gives
A crescendo.
Your book does give people a sense that we're not alone in this. There are many things that we can feel, and each of them is okay, but you also give us practical strategies
yes.
for moving through
Yeah.
and into places where we can make change and
That's right. And what one person in the book says may not resonate with you, but then maybe someone else will. And we didn't even talk about the enchanted beer can.
we didn't know. So Jonica is going to be signing some books, and I do encourage you to ask her about the enchanted beer can then.
Oh, it's a lot. Should I just tell the story? Have I got time?
We don't actually have to wrap it up.
Yes. All right. Well,
It's fun.
I'm gonna hand it over to Yana to wrap up now.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking them with a round of applause. We might just have time for a few questions. Jonica, I really liked what you said about change what you can, accept what you can't. And we've got a Zoom question that's come in that's quite relevant to that quote. And it says, how do we balance the huge weight of personal obligation with the desire to enjoy the benefits of Aussie middle-class wealth? For example, air travel for holidays. Must woke folk sacrifice more to make up for the climate sleepwalkers?
Such a thorny one, but I have been thinking about this and the difference between personal action and collective action. The trouble with the personal action is we're all going to lose. There is no way we can win at that game. You know, the only way you could would be to go and live as a hermit somewhere, because our entire world and way of life is saturated with fossil fuels. And so to put all the blame on us as individuals is actually part of the conspiracy of some of the corporations to make us so busy worrying about, as I am at the moment, how I can buy strawberries without plastic, that you don't have any time or energy to actually go out and do the things that will actually change the world. So the way I've come to think of the difference between your personal actions in your own life and the actions that you do to try and get collective change are to literally think of them as two separate things. So I think the things in your personal life, this is where I'm coming to, because I'm as guilty as anyone of not being anywhere near perfect on this. So it's your personal actions. You just each have to set your own boundaries and hopefully do a little bit better each year and be mindful of what more can I do, what more can I do. But, you know, the last thing you want is everyone turning on each other going, you still eat meat, you know, which I have been accused of recently. But even though I don't eat very much meat.
And it's okay.
It's only occasionally as a special treat. But yeah, and so, you know, to me, you know, then the sociopaths in the corner are just laughing because we're all, you know, attacking each other over whether we flew here. And meanwhile, they go off and dig up all the coal, you know. So your personal actions are really important because it's what the psychologists call living within your values. Living consciously, and whatever those boundaries are, you need to do the personal actions because you need them to feel at one with yourself so that you don't end up with a cognitive dissonance, and that should help you be doing more each year. But your effective action is the group action, whatever that is. And again, you know, it comes back to those two buckets. Business leaders can set net zero for their businesses. That's a big action. You know, you can obviously go on strikes. If you get, once we're allowed to strike again, you get 3.5% of the people out marching and you get social change. There's research to show that. I've joined Market Forces and some of the others, and I do the letter writing campaigns and things like that. So I've decided to put my pressure as an individual toward companies. But there's a few other things that I do. Whatever you do, whatever your inspiring vision is, it should involve some degree of collective action, because that is the most effective, and that fights back at this conspiracy that there has been. And when I say conspiracy, it's not a secret one. They've openly told us, they advertise and say, here are all the personal ways you can solve the planet, Meanwhile, as I said, we're just busy going on business as usual with our fossil fuels. So I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. And I think we might just have time for one more quick question. Does anyone in the audience have a burning question? Yes.
Jonica, it's just because you've got, because you've got the family connection with Malakuta, and I was just wondering, I'm sure Malakuta now the skies are blue and the forests might be regenerating a bit, people are perhaps building their houses again. I was just wondering, are the people down there, if has there been, because they've been at the front line of an event like that, whether there's been a shift in the way they perceive climate change, or whether they're kind of, it's a 1 in 100-year event and kind of moving on?
Two things. One is, this does not answer your question, but the back end of the book does go into the kind of trauma that these events convey on a community. And there's actually, for anyone who's been through a disaster, there's actually a special tips from psychiatrists and psychologists, the whole thing about this. So you've been through a disaster, some things to look out for. So there's a lot of people with PTSD. And I do allude, so this book, but I didn't want the book to be dominated, given what I was set out to write, by things like PTSD. So there's quite a few allusions to it. So it is a traumatized community, but it's not alone. I mean, I'm on the South Coast. There's a lot of other communities. Malakuta got all the attention. In terms of changing their minds, I don't know specifically. There are still a number of people who don't believe in climate change down there. And Rebecca Huntley talks about this, and her book is much more to the question of how do you change other people's minds. My book is entirely about how do you live with this knowledge. And part of the emotional burden is knowing that there are all these people that don't give a shit or don't believe. So Rebecca would say that these events just tend to reinforce people's pre-existing beliefs, and if they didn't believe in climate change before, they still don't. And how you shift that is probably her purview. Whether there are any specific people that have shifted, I don't know. But what my dad has shifted. Now that's actually, a quality. I don't think you'll get the full deniers to shift ever, but you can get the people who kind of believed in it to go, oh, maybe this is a bit more serious than I thought. And that's certainly what I've seen with my father, who comes from a very conservative, he says himself, very strong conservative voter, didn't believe climate change was real, then did, but, business will fix it. That's his take. Fortunately, business leaders are actually really stepping up at the moment, but, they could help with a bit of help from the government, couldn't they? Matt Keane is another hero in the book. But yeah, Dad, he's now going to turn his farm into more regenerative farming as a result of the events over Christmas and reading my book. No, he'd actually already started, to be honest, because he hadn't read the book. And I mentioned that in the last chapter, because to me that was such a profound qualitative shift just in someone that I knew. And as I said, it's one thing to look at the statistics, but you might know people in your own families and your own surrounds that they're gradually shifting, and that's that's what we need. We need everyone to shift across to seeing this as real imminent threat.
I wish we could stay longer and talk forever, but unfortunately that brings us to the end of tonight. Jonica will be inside signing copies of the book, and of course ask her about the magical beer can. If you could give another round of applause for Amanda and Jonica. Thank you so much.